is below. Please tell us where you're from and a little bit about why you're interested in today's topic. The second important tool is the Q&A icon. You can ask questions to the panel in that space. We'll do our best to answer all the questions during today's seminar, but anything that's not answered will be shared with the panel and perhaps they'll be able to answer in time. So this is how we're going to proceed today. We're going to begin with a presentation of two case studies about the effects of COVID-19 on women in agriculture. The first case study is led by the International Potato Center's Nozomi Kawazuka, and the case study was taken from Vietnam and Myanmar. And the second, led by Deepa Joshi and her team from the International Water Management Institute. And we'll have a short Q&A following both of their presentations. Then we're going to move to a small roundtable discussion among three agricultural feminist scholars who will use these case studies as a starting point for a more expansive discussion about today's topic. Those panelists include Rosemary Collard, an associate professor of geography at Simon Fraser University in Canada, Jessica Dempsey, an associate professor of geography at the University of British Columbia, and Fiorella Piccioni, a fellow in gender and diversity in food systems at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. Finally, we'll open the floor to a more wide-ranging question and answer session led by Esther Achandi, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi. She will expertly field your questions for the panel. But we're going to set the foundation for today's discussion right now. And we'll begin with an introduction from Ranjita Puskar, the leader of the evidence module with the CGIAR Gender Platform. Ranjita, good morning to you.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you very much. And good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today for this webinar. The CGIAR Gender Platform is very excited to host this event on a very intriguing topic, as you would have seen. But before we jump into this, I'd like to say a few quick words providing the background for this webinar. The CGIAR Gender Platform envisages a world in which gender equality drives transformation towards equitable, sustainable, productive, and climate resilient food systems. We work with gender researchers from the 15 CGIAR centers and their partners spread globally to design and implement a diverse, gender integrated and strategic gender research portfolio to identify solutions and trajectories to reduce gender inequalities within the dynamics of a changing food system. The platform's work is organized in 3 modules. They're called Evidence, Methods, and Alliances. And the evidence module is tasked with building a robust evidence base on gender equality in agriculture and food systems to support those transformations that we are talking about. Through collaboration with the gender researchers within and beyond CGIAR, we focus on delivering new evidence, identifying emerging issues, and closing the most important data and evidence gaps. We also communicate this evidence to different audiences to inform policy, practice, and investments. As COVID struck in late 2019 and the effects were beginning to manifest in 2020, it was clear fairly early on that women were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, a shock that turned into a lingering stress. And it was clear that women would be the hardest hit. At that point, we did not see much evidence emerging on women in food systems in the rural sector. And we wanted to systematically capture the effects of the pandemic on women in agri-food systems in diverse contexts, using robust methodology and actually go off the beaten track of, the regular usual measurements and very superficial kind of analysis. So what you will hear today are the findings from 2 research projects that were commissioned by the evidence module in this thematic area to generate evidence, new evidence on the impacts of the pandemic on gender equality, women in agri-food systems. So let me not hold you back from the very exciting presentations that are in store today, and let me turn you back over to Chris. Over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Ranjita. That was a very helpful overview. So we now turn to the first case study with Nozomi Kawazuka, who led this project in Vietnam and Myanmar to investigate how women working in fisheries, livestock, and horticultural production systems have been affected by the social, cultural, and economic pressures introduced by COVID-19. Nozomi, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
We can very well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I noticed some of people were attending in the team, not Zoom. So I was asking them to move. Now I think people moved. Apology for the confusion. Let's start. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to present our study on women's agribusiness during the COVID in Myanmar and Vietnam. I present this on behalf of the team from other centers and local partners. So this study employed a feminist political economy approaches as theoretical framework. I briefly explain about it. Please look at the figure on the right. Capitalist systems look at relationships between labor, capital, and market, the flowers part. Actually, economic activities depend on non-economic elements, such as natural resources, women's labor for child care, and food preparation, but they remain invisible and unrecognized, as if they are forever free resources for economic activities. So therefore, those non-economic aspects are neglected from account of how capitalist systems work, both conceptually, methodologically, and practically. This is a contradiction of capitalism. This ideology allows the capitalist economy to create multiple hierarchies in research disciplines, the society, and the household. Even research disciplines, its economic activities looks more important than research on non-economic activities. In this study, we explore interdependent relationships between economic and non-economic activities. So in the previous slide, I explained the contradiction of capitalism. Next, I explain how it played out in the pandemic. The pandemic itself is a part of crisis of capitalism that explores natural resources and reproduce inequality. So fragility of social provisioning comes from the contradiction of capitalism. An understanding of crisis within the capitalist economy, those flowers part, and its thinking is too narrow. We need to explore overall crisis tendencies inherent in structural features. So when you look at the crisis tendency of climate change, for example, we observe the roots of the problem is the same as COVID, the causes and unequal impact and consequences. So in the past, global responses to crisis reinforced gender gaps because of male privileged management policy and practice. So we want to change that. We cannot change tomorrow, but we want to change the thinking. This study builds on those literature and then show evidence through the empirical studies from the global south. So we conducted field work in 2 sites in each country. Lamdong province is the largest horticulture industry in Vietnam. So we interviewed women entrepreneurs such as seed importers, vegetable exporters, agriculture tourism operators. The impact of COVID on their business was mainly supply chain disruption and decreased demand, especially cut flowers and export vegetables. So next, Laokai province is located in Chinese border, and we looked at cross-border traders and local small-scale retailers, very poor women, mainly they are selling livestock. The impact of COVID was derived from a closure of borders between China and Vietnam and subsequent economic recession, including people used to migrate in China as a laborer. In Myanmar, the focus was fisheries in coastal states. In addition to COVID, they had the military coup since last year, and it affected very seriously on their livelihood, as well as our research method. So this is a qualitative research. We conducted in-depth interviews with 30 women. Due to COVID restriction, the half of the interview was hybrid in Vietnam, that one local researcher, she visited them face-to-face while I was connected online from Hanoi. For Myanmar, we did all interviews online through the local partners. So now I'm going to present the 3 key findings, and each findings have messages, key messages and implications for conceptual and methodological challenges. So first finding is that women's economic activities are essentially embedded in the family. In terms of family labor using connections and their husbands and in-laws support, and husbands' disagreement of their business, and a mother's feeling of guilt frequently mentioned. So let's introduce the story of Miss Ban. She is a Vietnamese woman, cross-border trader. Her husband suggested her to quit the job because she has 2 kids, 2 years old and 5 years old. She cannot manage childcare. So when my husband suggested that I quit my job, I thought about it over and over, but I decided to continue. I feel sorry for my children. I'm wondering if my children are disadvantaged because I'm busy all the time and I cannot be with them. And this situation worsened during the COVID. Another Vietnamese lady in London, she said, I divorced my husband because he disagreed with taking out a loan to expand my business, saying that running a small business was enough for a woman. So when women engage in economic activities, they cannot separate themselves from their identities as a mother, wife, and daughter-in-law. So I put woman on this middle between the underground and the flower part. So they stand between. The feminist literature suggests that male entrepreneurs can separate their business from the family. And actually separating is a kind of status. The research framework focusing on economic activities was originally designed to understand men's experience in business, but not women's. So key message here is that it is the patriarchy which constrains women's business, but not necessarily individuals' women's lack of capital, knowledge, and skills, which we often focus. So I want to suggest what are our goals of women's economic empowerment. How should we conceptualize women's economic activities? Methodological implication here is that male-oriented concept and methodology understanding agribusiness research need to be reframed because women are always between. So the second finding is informal agribusiness has its own safety net based on reciprocal support. I explain it from the relationship between women fish dealers and male fishers. In Myanmar, fish catches are uncertain. Fishers cannot go to fishing without credit for fuel boat. They therefore borrow money from women fish dealers, and women fish dealers borrow from wholesalers, and they then return the money by fish and make fish paste. Women fish dealers also receive financial and material support from their family to invest in a productive asset, to lend to fishers. Male fishers are often their friend, as a friend of their male relatives, friend of husband. Therefore, they have trust relations. During the COVID, it's interesting that fishermen keep borrowing money from their fish dealers to survive, or even ask to provide rice instead of money to fulfill the immediate needs. So fish dealer Dao Tintin, she said that I still provide credit because of COVID, she cannot sell, but still provide credit to fishers as I consider them part of my family. So women's business stands between an economic activity and non-economic activities. I put there that livestock, fisheries, and vegetable enterprise is a between. Therefore, research on understanding women's agribusiness need to look at both sides. A key message here is that women need to invest in reciprocal support relationships for maintaining their economic activities, which are often neglected in economic analysis. So non-economic activities are equally valuable for women to sustain their own business. So research on informal food systems, especially understanding of crisis, need pluralistic approaches as compared to formal food systems, which take places in isolation from family relations. We often follow the research on formal food systems, but informal system is completely different because women are involved both sides. So last finding is that COVID affect not only economic activities, but also non-economic activities. The latter has a significant implication for women's agribusiness. I introduced a story of Oma, who lost her husband in acute diabetes very suddenly, and her husband was her business partner, providing not only physical labor, carrying fish, helping her, but also business connections with fishers. So she said, I feel that my husband passed away because of a shortage of doctors and medical service due to the political crisis. When I resumed my work after my husband's death, I was exhausted as I had to weigh fish until 11 p.m. and I couldn't sleep at all. She had to do alone because husband used to help her. I feel depressed and I didn't want to continue working. I even thought of giving up this livelihood, but I couldn't because I have a responsible for providing for my daughters. She have to send her two kids to her adult nephew to look after because she now needs to focus alone to do a business before her husband supported. So the process in which women's agribusiness are affected by COVID is very complicated because their non-economic activities are also affected by COVID. In the global north, child care was highlighted, but in the global south, it is far more than the issue of child care. So here, without addressing social provisioning for the poor, especially for women, agriculture development alone cannot make agriculture resilient to ongoing overlapping crises which affect underground issues. And also I suggest women's empowerment should not be simply involving more women in market-oriented agriculture systems. And I think we all know about it. But I still very often see this message that women increased incomes and empowered. This message creates discursive power implicitly, as if we don't care about women's other roles, only care about incomes and economics. So I think we need a transdisciplinary approaches to research and development because we have more emphasis on and value on understanding non-economic, socially valuable activities, not only economics. So in conclusion, feminist political economy approaches allow us to look at root causes of poverty and inequality hidden in underground, as you see, which is social and political, as well as its framework allows us to look at the economic outcomes of them. That is the flower part. So how can we change dominant discourses and increase the value of research on non-economic activities, which are currently subordinated by research on economic activities? And how can we incorporate those women's experience into the post-COVID-19 development planning? This will be my question to panelists today. We want to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nozomi. That was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate that. And I do hope we get to that question about how to really create the structural change you're talking about, right? I mean, your point is very clear that there is insufficient recognition of non-economic labor from women, and that's been intensified during COVID-19. And we'll talk about that during the panel. Before we head over to Deepa, I want to ask you a little bit, just a quick response on how the pandemic affected your field work and what kind of restrictions it created during data collection.
At the beginning, Vietnam was not affected by COVID in 2020 at all, and we are very proud of that. But then, so we planned normally. However, when we went to Lao Cai province, was the last moment COVID started. Then we couldn't go to Ramadan province, so we had to postpone many times. We hoped that we can go anyway. But then took hybrid approach. This photo, she visited many times because I couldn't go, so I had to ask her to go many times. And then for Myanmar, we were not able to do field work at all. So we had to ask our partners to take online. Partners, they know very well the communities, but it was still very difficult for them to connect with the relevant people because of political situations. It was a great challenge. We had literature review how to conduct online and how it affects our quality of informations. And we discussed many times and did training online to Myanmar partners. Of course, our quality is not as good as we could go, but I believe that's still valuable, and we learned a lot from this research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think from all the interesting research that's emerging from the pandemic, one thing we don't talk about enough is the way it's created new modalities of research and the way we're learning to be flexible and creative in data collection. We'd never really faced that before. Thank you, Nozomi, so much for that compelling presentation. We're now going to turn to our second case study presented by Deepa Joshi. Her team worked in Egypt to understand how poor and marginalized women working in wastewater irrigation were restricted in their ability to negotiate increasing domestic and productive labor demands. Good morning, Deepa.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Nozomi, for sharing my slides. I presume they're going to be there shortly, so let me just wait a moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much again. So I'm going to be talking about water reuse, irrigation, and agriculture in Kapharel, Sheikh. So I just want to explain here that water reuse, irrigation means the reuse of irrigated water several times, about 4 to 5 times, through extensive systems of drains and canals. And this is the reality in most of Egypt, and particularly in the area that we worked in, which is Kapharel Sheikh, which is a small urban, peri-urban, largely dominantly rural governorate, 134 kilometers north of Cairo, and it's located in the North Nile Delta. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all my colleagues who've worked with me on this project. The next slide, please. So I'm going to reverse the order slightly here to emphasize that Nozomi and my presentation really speaks to the 3 issues that will be discussed by a panel that follows. While Nozomi's work talked about feminist political economy, the research that we did in Egypt talks about feminist political ecology, and it really emphasizes that if we want to understand gender power relations in agri-food systems, it's very important to connect the dots and do a scalar analysis of policies, practices, and very individual, personal, which is what we call embodied in feminist terms, everyday experiences of agri-food practices. The second point that is really important and is especially relevant in the context of my research location is the fact that the given context really brings about a clarity of the intersections and the influence and the connect between food, water, environment, and gender, and also points out how these linkages are deeply political. They're also intersectionally experienced, so it's not just gender, but gender plus class. And these relationships are further impacted by patriarchy, which exists both in the private domain, in the household, the community, in the fields, as well as in public domains of governance, water governance, for example. And what is also really interesting to discuss here is that because of these connections, because of the water scarcity, because of the reuse, in fact, much of the food that's produced in the location where we worked in is not consumed, but is sold relatively far away, to make the disconnect between the poor quality of water used for irrigation. So what COVID-19 did was to, really shine a light on these challenges. But the point that our research also really makes clear is the fact that crises come and go. But what is really important to understand is that deep-rooted systemic structural inequalities are what really need to be addressed and looked at and acknowledged more profoundly in the research that we do in terms of gender power relations in agri-food systems. The next slide, please. So as I said to you, this is based in the MENA region of Egypt. What was interesting is this is an ongoing project, and the findings from this project have a possibility to influence a phase 2 of the project. And what's really important to understand in the context of this larger project in which this research was embedded, but also the context of Egypt, is that irrigation efficiency is a national priority, and I'll explain why. Next slide. So there's been a number of studies being done by different CGIAR researchers in the region. So for example, Dina Najar and colleagues from ICARDA have done extensive work in the area, which shows that increasingly women are more and more involved in irrigation and agriculture in the region, even though they, the land allocation and the land ownership is very unequal. And also what's interesting that's also emerges from Dina's work is that there have been a number of interventions by the government to try and improve irrigation technologies and target these to women, to provide some sort of institutional support and to try and engage women in irrigation management. However, the title of their paper, earlier paper, says a lot. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Next slide. So what we wanted to do was to really zoom into one of the drainage areas in the region. And we did that on drain 7 because it is towards the tail end of several canals and several drains. And we conducted 15 focus group discussions in person, despite COVID restrictions, with 163 irrigators, both male and female. And from these, we selected 11 case studies, where we met these irrigators and really identified their individual personal experiences of this work. The next slide. So to give you some context of what does drain 7 or what does irrigating and agriculture in drain 7 look like. So there's a lot of sharecropping arrangements of small land holdings, 1 to 3 acres. They're mostly tenant farmers who are landless and marginalized. And the sharecropping arrangement is extremely feudal, informal tenancy agreements which date back to the colonial period. The landlord decides on what crops are to be grown and may or may not provide inputs and takes 3/4 of the produce and is also represented in agriculture collectives and water user associations and governance. And women rarely own land or rent land in Kapharel, Sheikh. And even when they do, they experience challenges of masculinity in the agriculture and the water associations. And what we found is that patriarchy, political economy, and individual relations come together to determine very diverse experiences. As I told you, most of the produce is not consumed except by the most marginalized. And women sharecroppers have really little to no role in crop value chains. It's mostly men who engage in the selling of these crops or making decisions on what is exchanged or consumed. What we found is that while so much of the policy focuses on irrigation and agriculture, that actually the keeping of livestock is what was really crucial for women's household income and for nutrition. The next slide. So what does feminist political ecology allow us to do, as it did in the case of this research, was to really put power politics center stage in our analyses. Second, it allows us to really do a critical analysis of dominant narratives, example of more and more emphasis on improving irrigation efficiency. And also what it necessitates and enables is making the voices of individual marginalized women, their unique individual personal experiences more visible. And we've also done some work on feminist political ecology in other recent publications, which really helped also inform this research. The next slide. So the findings, the first finding, what we find is that the whole water reuse irrigation in Egypt is really embedded in history and context of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. This is a map from 1907, which shows that the smallholder sharecropping arrangements have a long history going back to, when Egypt emerged as a cotton kingdom as an outcome of colonial legacy. There were land redistributions over the years. However, the state control over production remains very strong, also because in Egypt, only 4% of the land is arable, and agriculture, which was key to GDP, is slowly declining, also because of the water crisis. And Egypt has to import 44% of the cereal food grains. Nonetheless, it continues to export cotton and citrus fruits. So a really, contentious relationship that exists, which is a legacy of colonialism. The next slide. If you look at these maps, on the left from 1913, and the other one from 2013 shows that how the area has been, really experienced the expansion of canals and as well as drainage systems to introduce water efficiency. The next slide. Now, the second finding that we have is that as an outcome of these contentious irrigation efficiency, high national priority of agriculture and a persisting crisis of water and land, what we find is that, the experience of agriculture is shaped by gender power relations at scale, and patriarchy operates, as I said earlier, both in the private and public domains, shaping women's work and social relations, the risks they experience and opportunities, but also making this seemingly natural because, it conditions social obligations by way of social relations and gender identities. The next slide. So let me give you a glimpse of some of the women who are irrigating in the region. This is Fatima, who's 30, and her son. The next slide. So Fatima was married at 17 to a 75-year-old husband who's now 88, which seemed fairly common in many of our case studies. Her husband rents 1 acre of land, but it is actually she who does all the work because he's old and ill. And as I said, the crops that are grown, rice, wheat, and beetroot, is decided by the landlord. She consumes whatever share of her produce, 1/4, because the family has no other source of income, and they can only occasionally sell, also because her husband is ill and cannot navigate the market. She tends to her landowner's cow, and that is really her source. The milk that she sells, is her source of income and also nutrition. The landlord takes away young calves and sells it. And they really struggle with their medical expenses because she, as we found out, is also terminally ill, but she has not been able to invest in her treatment. So, agriculture, irrigation are really important to the family, undoubtedly, the reuse agriculture and irrigation. But the costs and demands on Fatima are disproportionately high. And what's also really interesting is the question to ask that while the policy focus is to engage more women in irrigation governance, people like Fatima will never ever have a say or place in irrigation governance at any level. The next slide. Here's Salma, whose story is slightly different. She and her husband own 3 acres of land, and she managed to buy 1 acre of land from her landlord. Nonetheless, she still lacks a registration ID, and she sees this as a problem of masculinity. She works in the field, but unlike Fatima, she can hire laborers and definitely is not as constrained as her. The next slide. So here's Ali, Salman Ali, who's 61, who's male, who owns 2 acres of land, and he irrigates only with drainage water. He does not let his young wife work in the field. He decides what to grow, and he had planted tomatoes to sell, but the water quality was not good, and he's really struggling with the debt that he incurred. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the smallholder producers who own land and who are better off than people like Fatima talk about the fact that they haven't eaten their own crops for the past 20 years. Next slide. So when we first met the women in Kapharel, Sheikh in 2020, even before the project started, they were talking about, the COVID crisis and how they couldn't travel far enough to sell the produce at a good price. And the reason they needed to travel far is because there is this notion, but also the reality that very polluted water is being used for irrigation. So as long as this link is established, you don't get a good price for your produce. But what we, as the research pointed out, that this is not a problem, an issue that is common to all individuals and all persons. And it also points to some really serious issues about this type of nature of production where, you produce and work so long and so hard, and yet you are not able to consume the produce. The next slide. So in sum, maybe just to add here, that what we see are very diverse experiences, even if we look at the small number of case study examples I shared, whether it's Fatima and her husband and her daughter, Salma and her husband, Salman, what we find is that gender, class, patriarchy, and age cut across these experiences. What was really intriguing, we wondered, was what happened to so many of the first wives who were divorced, for various reasons, many times because they were not able to produce children. So in terms of these experiences, what we see is differences in land ownership, in access to quality of water and other sources of income. And we also see, that while patriarchy is very much the norm at home and in relation to agriculture and irrigation, there are individual differences. And it's interesting to add here that the government interventions on land reforms and gender, what it pointed out is that a study in 2000 pointed out that 95% of the land was still owned by men, and the largest proportion of female landholders, who are 12%, falls within the category of who own less than 1 acre. And what is also interesting is that even when land is owned by women, they pass it on to their sons and not to daughters. Again, the influence of social conditioning and patriarchy. The next slide. So this is my very final slide, is that, what lessons emerge from this work is really that feminist political ecology as a methodology allows, changing the focus from looking at women to really looking at gender, to looking at class, patriarchy, and masculinity. And really pointing out the need for much more intersectional analyses and granular data, and making space for embodied experiences in the type of research that we do. It also, the second issue that it points out to is that if current focus on top-down technical interventions continue, then there's very less likelihood that marginalized landless households and very poor women like Fatima are going to benefit and impact from these interventions. So if there's really an attempt to address the irrigation problem and the food security problem, then you need to look at and begin from below. But I think that is the point that we want to make. The policy emphasis sees the problem as an irrigation problem, and that obscures the reality of the food security and the deeply intersectional experiences of these. So it points to the contradictions between irrigation, water reuse, agriculture, food systems, and food security, which are some of the things that we are able to make visible because of our use of the feminist political ecology approach. That's it for me. Thanks so much.
Deepa, thank you so much. A really wonderful presentation. I'm struck by many things, but in particular, the way you talk about the fact that gender dynamics always occur in a particular historical context, which in Egypt is, of course, is the legacy of colonialism, and how that has a unique and specific impact on the environment. And I thought that was a wonderful explanation. And I'm also reminded of one of your last points, which is that we, unfortunately, all too frequently in development, focus on the technical intervention without considering the political context in which that technological innovation is inserted. Where do you envision yourself going with this research next, Deepa?
So this is very difficult, right? Because the findings that we have are not, I think, going to find much favor at a political institutional context, where the focus is really to keep on making the irrigation efficiency, to improve irrigation efficiency, and to really invest in the infrastructure development aspects of irrigation. And also, I think raising these questions about the continued, export of cotton in Egypt is a politically challenging issue to discuss at a national level. So I guess we are going to struggle a little bit with our findings, but we've already had one level of intensive discussions with local and national stakeholders, and we found that there was some appetite for this information, because it was really like the elephant in the room. Everybody knows about it, but nobody is really talking about it.
I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. Thank you. Thank you again, Deepa, for a really compelling presentation. So now we move from the Research Institute to the university, and we're going to move to a really interesting roundtable here with our friends Rosemary Collard, Jessica Dempsey, and Fiorella Piccioni. And they're going to discuss today's case studies in light of their own research to further illuminate today's discussion. So I will hand it over to you for your presentations. And while we're setting up the presentation here, I want to remind everybody that you can enter questions in the Q&A box. If we don't have a chance to get to them today, we'll get to them in time. So Jessica, I see your face first, so I think that means you're going to lead off. Good morning.
Okay, great. Yes. What a excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Deepa and Nozomi, for connecting these dots for us all today. So I am coming to you all from Vancouver, British Columbia. Yes, it is very, very early, but I don't feel that tired, because these are really important conversations to be happening. So Rosemary and I are going to both just say a little bit together, and then Fiorella is going to follow up. So where we live, COVID brought a lot of new recognition to care work being undertaken on gendered and racialized lines, low-paid service work in grocery stores, healthcare workers. There was this event that happened here 7 p.m. every night. People would like bang pots and pans in celebration of healthcare workers, and also the unpaid work of parents juggling work inside and outside the home as schools shut down. There was so much recognition. I dug this out, just a little prop. There was actually in the New York Times Magazine, there was an article, a spotlight during COVID on Silvia Federici, is her great feminist political economist, and on her work in the 70s for wages for housework, and the subtitle is, "For decades, Silvia Federici has argued that domestic labor should be worth much more. The pandemic has proved her right." So this is pretty mainstream publication. So for a moment, there was this kind of recognition of the value and crucial importance of reproductive labor, and on all that work in Nozomi's figure that happens in the roots system, in the soils, and a spotlight on the crises in that sphere in terms of the double shift and the kind of exhaustion that happens often by women doing the double shift, you know, working outside and inside the home, kind of squeezed in that middle part in Nozomi's diagram, working in both spheres, productive and reproductive. And COVID made it really clear how much we often rely on low paid or unpaid reproductive work. And the research presented today and in our pre-event conversations really shows how there's common concern across a lot of different contexts. And this looks different in different places, as Chris just highlighted, right? That these things don't play out the same. But because social reproduction occupies such a specific and really enduring place in capitalism, there are strong commonalities. A focus on the economy in a formal sense, the GDP, obscures more than it reveals, particularly as these crises are downloaded onto families and so often onto women, as the research illustrates. So COVID may have added more challenges, but clearly the stresses on women and on reproductive labor are well established and very deep. I'm passing it to Rosemary.
Hi, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. It's really nice to be here. I've enjoyed the presentation so much already, and I'm very happy to be here. So Jess and I have been working together for a really long time, and our empirical work is actually quite different. It's not about agriculture. So we've decided to focus our comments more on this question of how these contradictions within capitalism breed crises, as Jess has sort of already hinted at, and as the presentations hinted at. And I guess one of the first places to start is, was I'm listening to the presentations, I was thinking about just how crucial it is to stress that this arrangement that Nozomi's figure captures, this relationship between the underground and the flowers, is quite distinctive to capitalism. And so we're really talking about this very specifically capitalist economy and set of capitalist social relations. And this is what Jess and I study in a different empirical context, especially focused on species endangerment and extinction. But I thought we would I could take a bit of a step back and paint that picture in a slightly different way. So taking Nozomi's wonderful flower figure and placing it alongside the theoretical kind of framework and conceptualization that Jess and I have worked with. And in that, we think about the underground as constituting the realm of reproductive energies and work, and the above ground as the productive realm. And feminist political economists, as the presentations already hinted at, especially Nozomi's, have long drawn attention to that underground. This is the realm of largely unwaged work, of non-commodified natures and social relations. And this is the realm that doesn't officially typically count as constituting the economy within a capitalist frame, but it's actually crucial to economic functions and relations. And in a broader casting of what constitutes economic energies and relations, like anything that sort of helps us get by and distributes value, this realm of the reproductive is actually crucial and is economic. And one of the theorists that Jess and I have worked with in understanding all of this is a German feminist political economist, Maria Mies. And Maria Mies offers us what she calls the iceberg model of capitalist patriarchal economies. And so the iceberg looks fairly similar to Nozomi's flower arrangement, but instead of an underground and above ground, we have a water line above water and below water. And so the above water is the productive realm and the below water is the reproductive. And this corresponds to what's essentially a division of labor, and a very gendered division of labor. That's a foundational element of capitalist social relations. And its base is this separation of work into productive and reproductive spheres, where the productive is what's rendered, typically cast as economic, producing commodities, remunerated with wages, carried out in factories or office towers, the visible part. And the reproductive is this more hidden realm of work that Nozomi already touched on a lot. This is very generally life's work, not just raising families or having kids, but also creating and maintaining social bonds, caring for the sick and the elderly. Often this work is conducted in relatively private domestic spaces. And all of this work is essential not only to producing future workers, but also to refueling those workers, the waged workers, cooking, cleaning, nursing those workers back to health. This work is typically naturalized as women's work and is largely unpaid. And it's sort of coded as being performed for the sake of love and virtue, as opposed to money, as Nancy Fraser says. One of the things that we've really, one of the reasons why we've turned to Maria Mies is because she doesn't just talk about women's work, what's coded as women's work occupying the underwater of the iceberg, but she also makes important, what she calls underground connections between the position of this women's work and the work of people in the colonies, which is a deeply undervalued work that's siphoned off for capitalist or colonial gain. And then she also connects it to the work of nature. And that's another, like, a big reason why we've looked to her. So when she's doing this, she's not saying that, women's work and the work of people in the colonies is closer to nature and that these are all sort of similar kinds of work. Saying that would get us quite dangerously close to a kind of essentialist ecofeminist argument that positions women or people in the colonies as closer to nature. So what she's not saying that. What she's saying is that the work of nature, reproductive work that's often conducted by women, and work in the colonies occupy similar structural positions within capitalist social relations. And especially these are cheapened forms of work or devalued forms of work that capital depends upon while it also devalues. And you can think in terms of the work of nature here as like bees performing the pollination of crops, nature is absorbing wastes, wetlands, filtering water. And so this realm of this sort of three-part constitution of the underwater, colonized labor, non-human labor, and women's labor, and energies and materials, this is essential to capitalist accumulation, but it is also treated as sort of free or cheap, and it is highly neglected. And this is a very crisis-ridden situation. Jess.
Back to me. So, and I think this is part of what I think both of the talks we're getting at this is that the social ecological sphere is devalued, but at the same time remains absolutely necessary to productive capitalist accumulation, to the flowers, to the tip of the iceberg. And as a result, the productive and reproductive realms exist in this like contradictory relationship, one that tends towards crisis. A contradictory relationship because the formal productive sphere both needs and tends to devalue the reproductive, and tends towards crisis because while social reproductive labor is a condition of possibility for the tip of the iceberg, for the flowers, for the productive system, economic system, for accumulation, in a capitalist system oriented to unlimited accumulation and relentless extraction, the system tends to destabilize the very processes of social reproduction on which it replies, which is a quote of Nancy Fraser's. Destabilize in that there's a systemic drive towards appropriation of time and labor that is necessary for people's own survival or subsistence production. And that's Maria Mies's concept of super exploitation, right? That there's the systemic drive is towards like taking more and more of the time and materials that are necessary for everyday people to kind of make a life in the world. And crisis emerges when people, the women, for example, highlighted in Vietnam and Egypt, spend so much of their time on domestic and labor demands. These escalating burdens inhibits their ability and their families' abilities to thrive, live, survive, exhaustion, depression, running to stand still, all of those things. And here, and this is the work that Rosemary and I've done, we work on wildlife and near where we live here. Not only is it that humans' time and labor for their own survival, not only is that appropriated, but non-humans as well. When it comes to non-humans exploitation, there is also this systemic drive towards appropriation of time, labor, and materials needed for their survival. And environmental harms are also downloaded into this cheapened or sacrificial reproductive realm, which absorbs the harms generated to make profit in the productive sphere too. So that's another way to kind of build these underground connections that I think Mies is calling us to do. And in general, then capital depletes and degrades this below water life world by siphoning off and appropriating the energies and materials dedicated to the reproduction of life itself, kind of eroding and causing crisis in the reproductive realm. In this way, and here's where we get to the role of patriarchy and other sort of systemic hierarchies, the relegation of some bodies, lives, materials to this underwater realm, to the outside, is really crucial for value production. So accumulation really thrives within a set of social systems that mark some as outside, as lesser. And this is a point long made by feminists and Black theorists of capitalism, from Sylvia Federici to Ruth Gilmore, who really argue that global capitalism is made up of these multiple modes of devaluation that intermingle but are not reducible to each other. So the devaluation of Black lives, care work, Indigenous lands, non-human animals, and so on. Racism, patriarchy, anthropocentrism, colonialism, these modes of devaluation sort of enshrine the inequality that capitalism, that productive economic system really needs in a way. And that's like insights of, again, Federici and Gilmore. And we'd really like to hear from others on the panel of how these kind of structural hierarchies of gender and beyond really matter for production in your field sites and contexts. We can talk a bit more about that, about how this plays out in the spaces we study if there's interest later. Back to Rosemary.
So I'll just close us off by saying, just to make it a bit more concrete too, that as Jess was just saying, that there are these logics of devaluation at work within, patriarchy, racism as these social systems. And Jess and I have been we've not studied labor, or that traditional kind of focus of feminist political economists, but instead our focus has really been on the structures that enshrine those logics and enshrine these differences, or enshrine the productive reproductive split, and that also modulate the crises that are engendered. And so in particular, we've looked at the state. And so I am really curious, because the state is at once, this modern structure that has commonalities in many parts of the world, largely in some ways as a result of colonialism and imperialism, but it also looks quite different in different places. So one question that I might throw back to the presenters, or just that I would be interested to talk about in the Q&A, would be about the role of the state within these different research contexts. And then a sort of related question about how one might organize politically the people who your work is conducted with, Nozomi and Deepa. If there are moves to organize them, and how would that look? And would it involve the state, or would it happen outside of the state? Would it contest the state or use the state? And then just in closing, I guess after that question would be to come back to COVID, because I know that's obviously another focus of this panel, and to say that, to pick up sort of where Jess started off, which is that we know that COVID has not single-handedly created the crises that result from the productive reproductive split. The crises here at work from this contradiction were already spiraling out all over the world But COVID has exacerbated these crises and shone a spotlight on them. And in many ways, some states have been forced to respond and modulate this crisis with at least temporary fixes. Here in Canada, this included things like monthly payments to people to help them get by if they were had lost their jobs or things like this. So yeah, I'm curious also about how states have responded to the crises that COVID has shone a spotlight on in people's parts of the world, in the audience and the other panelists. But we'll leave it there, unless you have anything else last to add, Jess. All right, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Jess and Rosemary. That's really, I think we talked about in our organizational discussion that we don't often hear the word capitalism, and we don't often hear the word political in CGIAR. And now, Rosemary, you've raised this other specter of the state. We often talk about governments, but we don't often talk about the state. And maybe when we get to the Q&A section next, we can talk a little bit about how an organization like CGIAR can become friendlier or provide space for those types of discussions, because you've provided a really nice theoretical framework for the very excellent data-driven research that Deepa and Nozomi have presented. So let's bracket a few of those questions for our Q&A. Fiorella, we're going to go over to you for a few comments before we head to Esther and the Q&A. Good morning.
Hello, hi, thank you so much. And thanks again to the presenters, Rosemary and Jessica, for starting this conversation. So I was asked to, on top of reflecting on the questions that were open to all panelists, I was also asked to present some of the methodological aspects of measuring and embedding social reproduction in broader analysis in the realm of agri-nutrition and food systems research. Now that I've been hearing what Rosemary and Jessica said, I will do that later if we have time, because I want to connect myself with the other things I wanted to talk about. And it's interesting because, I mean, we did have some conversations before the meeting, but we didn't really coordinate with Jessica and Rosemary. And some of the things I want to say are so linked. So for me, my work is embedded in food systems. I use political economy, feminist political economy, in particular social reproduction lenses, to understand modern food systems in the capitalist, in neoliberal capitalism. So to me, asking myself what it means to integrate social reproduction approaches to agriculture and food systems open two different questions. The first type of question is, how do we organize to demand change for better food systems? And the second one is, how do we integrate and connect our analysis of at the micro level, so the famous embodiment of struggles, and the macro level, so all the stuff that happens at the political economy level. So let me start first with the way we organize resistance. So when we mobilize a social reproduction approach and other feminist lenses, it becomes clear that the dualism between private and domestic spheres and the public and productive sphere collapse. This is all fictional. Hence, a feminist take on mobilization and resistance will intrinsically go beyond the sole engagement with the more traditional ways of organizing labor. But it will also withdraw, if you're, for example, thinking in terms of strikes, we withdraw both productive and reproductive work, so unpaid and paid. Secondly, using a feminist approach, the mobilization cannot stay sector-specific. Social reproduction feminist lens will naturally connect all the struggles against exploitation. And this is what has happened in 2017, when in more than 50 countries in the world have organized the famous women's strikes, and this had happened until 2019, where women, LGBTI+ community around the globe gathered assemblies to protest against gender-based violence, attacks on reproductive health, labor exploitation, and neo-colonialism practices. So the unemployed, domestic workers, sex workers, and workers in the voluntary sector all united and participated in a strike that refused to perform labor, either productive or unproductive. And the slogan of the day was, if we stop the world. So as Veronica Gago, who has theorized around this international feminist strikes, movements, she points out that these movements that are interconnected and connect different struggles create a new cartography of feminist politics. This politics is able to challenge forms of interconnected violence, exploitation, and extraction. It remaps the spatiality and temporality of power, transcending borders, not only geographical ones, but also borders between public and private, work and home, street, private, human, and nature. And this is, I think, is very important to connect the, to go back to Nozomi's picture that connects the, that depicts the upper part of the diagram, which is the capitalist world, and all the processes that happen underneath from the humans that are devalued, but also the natural resources that are valued. More methodologically and conceptually, for me that come from a political economy background, and I use labor as my central piece to understand power and relationship that shape productive and unproductive work. A feminist political economy in understanding food system means to me that we recognize a priori the interconnectedness between productive and reproductive work. So this means that these two dimensions shape each other. So reproductive work is shaped by how capitalism organizes reproductive work, but reproductive work, on the other hand, also shapes the way productive work is organized. So this understanding then enables us to embed the analysis of the embodied manifestations of capitalism, so well-being, health, and nutritional outcomes for those that work in the agri-nutrition sector, and the macro level factors. So when we perform a feminist political economy analysis of food systems, we embed the analysis within the neoliberal capitalist organization of life. This is characterized by unequal labor conditions, financialization of food, unequal terms of trade, and processes of systematic deconcentration of resources in the public sector, and particularly those that enable social reproductive functions that regenerate us as people and as workers. And the question I would like to then raise for all of us, and I've been thinking about it quite a lot, it's how does a food system that is embedded on social reproduction looks like? What are the differences with the ones that, well, the current one we are using, we're used to see now? And I just wondering how much time I have, so I can go maybe and share my slides for the methodological.
Please do. We have 5 to 6 minutes. You're good. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. I'll do that really quickly. So, okay, the second part of my reflection for the panel is so yeah, basically showing some of the methods that I've been involved in and used to measure and make more visible the unpaid and social reproductive work of women in context of in rural areas, rural context in the global south. So firstly, so first these projects were all set in agrarian contexts, where there was low level of mechanization, and they were based in India, Nepal, and Ghana. So there were two different sets of projects. The first project was basically a study that was positioned in the agri-nutrition literature. So it was interested to connect the agriculture and the nutrition aspects of agricultural development. While the second project, the one based in Cambodia, looked at the various manifestations of depletion through social reproduction of processes of financial inclusion. So the taking loans and for purchase food and pay medical bills in the global south. And the themes explored by these studies were intra-household, gender-differentiated labor allocation and energy expenditure patterns, with the overarching aim to capture the intensity of the full ranges of rural livelihood activities, not only the productive ones, and link the physical activity dimension to agri-nutrition literature that mainly focuses on food intake and diets. So The project integrated the use of accelerometry devices with other conventional time use and food intake instruments. And this is a picture of an accelerometry device of one of the many that exist on the market. It is rather small. It's similar to a matchbox, and participants wear them around their waist with a belt. So how does it work? It measures actual acceleration across 3 different axes: vertical, anterior, posterior, and medial lateral. And it converts acceleration into movements and then movements into energy expenditure. So we work with this particular model, which is a research-graded device called ActiveGraph for a number of various desirable characteristics that I've listed below. All the features were listed below, which I'm actually going to read. That is non-intrusive, waterproof, suitable for conditions, for various conditions, rugged, and they have no screen, so they do not change the behavior of the wearer. They have long batteries, they have a comprehensive software, they are reliable, and they have been assessed in previous studies, and they have a contained cost. So all these characteristics make these accelerometry devices particularly suitable for studies that aim at capturing habitual activities in environments where people normally conduct them, and not in controlled lab environments where previous studies on activities and energy expenditure were based. So in this sense, accelerometry devices are able to provide a more realistic picture of energy expenditure of this habitual work, but also reflect how individuals negotiate physical endurance and fatigue during the day. Move on here, I'm showing how our multi-scalar and mixed method approach was organized in our projects. So we firstly started with the quantitative data. We triangulated the evidence from the 3 quantitative streams, and we linked energy expenditure to energy intake. And we also produced energy expenditure profiles of the different activities, productive and reproductive, of our respondents. Secondly, after conducting qualitative data collection, and in particular, we use photo voice, starting with pictures about food to unpack stories around changing food environments, soil and water contamination. And this is where I really found a lot of similarities with Deepa's presentation, but also stories around work and debt. And we linked the patterns of food consumption of work intensity from the quantitative work with the qualitative work, adding more depth to the stories that we have collected. And then finally, and very importantly, we have positioned these narratives within the political economy context. So financialization of food, colonial history, commercialization of agriculture, gendered land tenure, labor law, terms of trade, and absent or minimal provision of the welfare state. So finally, a couple of reflections on the advantages and challenges of using these methods. So first of all, using technology and wearable activity trackers are in a way great, that provide measurement to an often neglected dimension of women's work, which is the physical intensity aspect of women's work. So in the agricultural literature, and especially and the nutritional literature, the focus on women's work is mainly around time burden. And there is not enough evidence or debate around the intensity of the work, and there is still some notion of women's work being the light work. And also this type of methodologies, when integrated to studies that have rich and pluralistic methodologies, can enhance our understanding of processes of depletion through social reproduction. And this particular part really needs an embedding into the more general political economy at the national level as well as the global level. In terms of challenges, clearly there are some technical limitations in with any technological tool, but also very important ethical considerations that really there is really no shortcut for them, and there needs to be, to me, a much more deeper conversation and protocol in making sure that these shortcuts are not taken. There are also some limitations of the intrinsic to the time use and food intake instruments. That's, people in the nutrition sector, agriculture sector know very well. They are very much, they're fallible as well. But I think more conceptually, I think we need to ask ourselves why we are measuring something and what it serves us when there are other alternatives in really understanding fatigue, time the use of time in activities that you could use you could not do if there were like other structures in our economy and our society. And I think that's it. Oh yeah, and then there are some resources to kind of check out our research on this particular theme. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you so much, Fiorella. We really appreciate that. This has been a really nice pattern. I think we've started with 2 great case studies grounded in data, 2 nice succinct conversations about theory, and then Fiorella, we turn to you and we see how theory can inform method, which is really, I was part of a study similarly in Nairobi a few years back where we placed GPS devices on water collection jugs for women living in the slums. And one of the, obviously we were trying to find out where's the best place to add a water resource. But what we also learned in the process was the immense amount of time that women and children devoted to collecting water every day in these very difficult areas to live. So thank you very much to all our panelists. We're going to move to a wide open Q&A moderated by Esther Achandi from ILRI. And Ranjita, we don't want to forget about you. We want to ask you to jump back into the fray. We know you're there. And we have a few questions to prime the pump, so to speak, but we also want to encourage the panelists to talk to each other about some of the topics we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting panel that we've had. It's been really insightful, and I hope everyone is gleaning in and really has their minds tickled by the arguments that they're getting from this and adding their insights too. And we have a few questions that have come in through the Q&A, but then I'll just begin with one comment reflecting on Rosemary and Jessica's work, how they really explain the 2 icebergs. One iceberg that looks at the economic capitalism dividing between what is looking like the economic, but that is all supported by something that's not visible, and that's the work that comes from Gibson and Graham. But then they pit Gibson and Graham against the arguments that come from Maria Mies, who talks about the extractiveness of what we look at as capitalism. And one of the most interesting questions that she raises is how the super exploitation of the undervalued and the non-valued labor, but this is super exploited because these are the ones that support the exploitation of labor. So women colonies, the environment, all these are overly exploited, but they also facilitate capitalists. They support kind of labor exploitation by the capitalistic state that we see. And that's very, very insightful. But again, the question that rises in my mind is, if capitalism is a form of valuation that has come to be accepted and its appropriation is continuously accepted, how can we as researchers come up with a different way of valuation? How can we incite people to come up with a different way of valuation? Would it call for the norm, looking broadly at the norms? Is it the norms that have been persistently encouraging capitalism in its endeavors? That can be my reflection question to you. And I would like to call upon you also to think about some of these questions that we've raised previously, that there's cross-sectoral approaches to food, to water, and the environment, and gender complexities. So as we review what the panel has discussed, what are your thoughts on the cross-sectoral approaches? And then also, what are your thoughts about how feminist political economy, the perspectives that it brings, how can these perspectives be adopted to incorporate transdisciplinary research? And then lastly, as we reflect on COVID-19 as a crisis of capitalism and gender, what evidence exists for systematic transformative change? What is the evidence we are generating, and what kind of evidence do we as researchers hope to generate? Those are my reflections. However, in the Q&A, we had some questions that came in, And there was a question from Debashish Chanda. Debashish was asking Nozomi. Nozomi responded to that question, but there was a question that he asked that what is more critical? What is a more critical constraint for women in agriculture? Is it the system, which is capitalism, or is it family relationships between husband and wife or in-laws? So you're all welcome. Anyone in the panel, you're welcome to add your voice and to address this question. Welcome. Or I'll please kindly come in. Nozomi, would you interject? I saw you had a bit of an answer you posted in the chat. Would you like to expound on that?
Thank you, Esther. Your big question I was thinking about the earlier. It was a very great question, Esther, you raised. I think Devashish, I think it's both sides. So as Esther said, this capitalist system is reinforcing this familiarization, patriarchy. And patriarchy is also contributing to sustain capitalist systems. So it's both circles. We have to stop this circle, but it's very difficult. We are not challenging capitalism. We cannot, suddenly stop. But how we can, bring critical aspects, and we are not aware of those invisible parts theoretically and conceptually, also practically our research. I think it's a big, big question, but we cannot ignore it. As CGIAR, if we ignore, can we all keep trying to solve all solutions by technologies? It's not possible because technology itself creates inequalities. So how can we stop these vicious circles? And as a CG Center, we don't have to do everything, capitalism analysis and social science, but we can have a partnership, so transdisciplinary research and correct all. We are lacking evidence, as Esther said, because of this, lack of innovation in research and transdisciplinary approaches. I think as a panelist can add some. Thank you.
Thank you, Nozomi. Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to add their voice? Welcome. Right. Do we have anyone else that would like to add their voice? I saw there was a question that Esther had posted in the chat. This was to you, Deepa. She was asking for clarification about whether the producers, these farmers, whether the tenant farmers, why the tenant farmers do not eat their own produce. Would you like to add to that?
Thanks, Esther. I did actually answer the question, but let me just emphasize here again. So, first of all, growing with water reuse is not itself a really bad thing for the crops, except that it's not great for the environment, and the runoff to the sea is really impacted as well. But what is problematic here in this case is that the drains also collect polluted water, untreated water, both from industrial and domestic sources, and this gets thoroughly mixed up with the drainage water from agriculture fields. And this is the quality of water available to farmers and smallholders who are at the tail end of the command area, the irrigation area. Now, what is interesting is that officially it is mentioned that you can only irrigate with reuse water, that is the drainage water, and not with polluted water. But then the reality is that all the polluted water is draining into these drainage canals. Everybody knows about it. Nobody, speaks about it. But those irrigators, the farmers who are growing, obviously, would prefer to not eat food grown with this water. So what they do commonly is that they exchange food grown with the polluted and reuse water for a lesser amount of food crops, let's say rice, let's say 100 kgs of rice, I exchange for 80 kgs of rice from somewhere else with traders. Now this makes its way surreptitiously into the markets and is sold somewhere off disguised as, rice grown, let's say, with fresh water. So that's how it happens. And also most farmers, then if they're able to, take their produce to faraway markets where the links can't be established with where they are from, and try to get a good price for the produce. But as I mentioned, there are many smallholder farmers, tenant farmers who don't have the ability or the time or the energy or are constrained by masculinities that operate in the marketplace, or by social mobility restrictions, and are unable to travel to these market places to exchange or try to get a better price for their produce. So they are the ones who are consuming this, but there's really an emotional anxiety, and that was what we noticed amongst all the producers. There is this emotional anxiety that is so relevant, and yet is so ignored. I wonder if this is a good time to answer the question that Rosemary and Jessica had raised about organizing and collecting, or should I wait to do that, Esther?
Sure. You can answer that in a minute, and then we'll hand back to Christopher and to Ranjita.
Okay, so I
in 1 minute, yeah.
Yeah, in the case of the location of our research, I think the Arab Spring has a lot to say about what works and doesn't in organizing and movements, and so I think I don't need to say further other than that, to also say, to add gender to that, then you can really understand the challenges of organizing and making voices heard. However, individual women have, driven by the anxiety, driven by the stress, tried to get cleaner water into the fields, and really made an effort, also by paying money, whether that was official or bribe, not very clear, but and some of it has worked, but it only works for those who are able to do this with enormous amount of effort. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. You're most welcome. And I'd like to pass this back to Chris. Chris, you're welcome to close off.
Thank you, Esther. Actually, I had a question for the panel, and it's a rather expansive question, so I apologize, but I would be interested to hear a few opinions on this, which is, we've come across this theme of how do we improve the valuation of women's non-economic labor or non-productive labor. So understanding that there's not a magic solution to that question, I'd be curious to see what each panelist feels about what's the best path to do that. Is it politics? Is it, at a structural level or at the state level? How do we get all countries to the level of a Nordic country like Norway or Sweden, where there does seem to be, where we know they have the highest valuation for non-economic labor? How do we move other countries in that direction? And if you can answer this correctly, you'll win the Nobel Peace Prize, but no pressure on anybody, no pressure.
I mean, I can jump in a little bit. I just wanted to make sure there was no one else. I mean, one of the things, and we spoke about this when we met, like, to prepare for this, is one of the things that really struck me was the response of central banks to the COVID-19 pandemic, and just as an institution that actually has a lot of and increasingly is like having a lot of power in a lot of countries and in the globe as a whole. And here in Canada, the central bank decided it would buy up a whole bunch of assets, like and these were mostly companies that were the shares of companies that were flagging during the pandemic, fossil fuel companies, car manufacturers, and some care homes, actually, like privatized care homes. And it really strikes me that there's just the way in which that institution, which is really meant to like deal with supposedly inflation and employment, it's just like such a narrow rendering of the economy. So even just like dreaming a little bit about like an institution that is at arm's length from the government, right? It's meant to be this more technical institution. What if it actually took seriously the work of social reproduction, and what would that look like? What would we ask that institution to do to support and really value this labor? And I think it's a really fun kind of opening, because we have an institution that's meant to like sort of deal with crisis, economic crisis, and then like imagining it being more, and I would love to hear if others have idea of what we would ask that bank to do.
I appreciate that dreamers aspect. It's very important. Any others? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody, and we're going to go to Ranjita for a few closing comments before we end today's session. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Ranjita?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, we could just go on and on. What fascinating presentations and interventions by the panelists. Thank you so much. You know, each of you have highlighted the importance of using feminist approaches to surface the structural and social constraints women face in agri-food systems. Nozomi's presentation demonstrated how women's economic and non-economic activities are intertwined, inextricably intertwined, and all of you have reinforced that. Deepa's presentation highlights the power relations that influence, you know, both economic and non-economic activities. And it also became very clear that COVID was not the only challenge the women were facing. In fact, some of them actually thought they had bigger challenges than that. And COVID only exacerbated those and actually helped surface the very deep-rooted systemic and structural inequalities more prominently. And then we can see that how, you know, COVID and climate change are actually reinforcing inequality. I mean, all these studies, and another study that we did in the gender platform recently, where we analyzed the gender responsive of policies and programmatic measures put in place to deal with the pandemic in 3 African countries, that highlighted the male privileged crisis management, as Nozomi put it. It was obvious that women were really not considered, you know, or their needs and preferences during this policy making or, you know, designing the measures and implementing them. And they actually, I think it actually showed that it widened the gender gaps that already exist. And often when we talk about, you know, women and entrepreneurship so that, you know, they have more resilient incomes and livelihoods, we often talk about providing women with technical and financial support, building their skills, knowledge, so that, you know, we can support them to be entrepreneurs. But what's clear is that unless we deal with the patriarchy and the time poverty they face due to their social commitments and burdens, we can't really make much progress. And more participation in agri-food systems doesn't mean higher empowerment or more benefits. And we are talking about systemic change here. That is what is needed. And we've been talking about gender transformative approaches in CGIAR for a while, and that's what we need. Methods and tools and approaches that help us identify and address the root causes of the inequalities, rather than those which just help us treat the symptoms of the inequalities. And I think, you know, it isn't just enough to stop at diagnosing these things. What's important is how we move from there to solutions, more actionable solutions to address them. If we, you know, we talked about, and you know, as each of you, each of the speakers has emphasized, if we have to do this effectively, we need very diverse methodologies, concepts, pluralistic methodologies, and we've got to get out of our comfort zones. And then, you know, so we talked about evaluations. Yes, really important, but how do we actually make sure once we develop those evaluations, let's say the methods, how do we actually get the governments or you know, policymakers to take those up? So how do we take this from this understanding, analysis to action so that we can actually have change? So this is really a call, I think, to the gender research community to embrace more diverse and transdisciplinary approaches, not just to surface the real challenges, but actually also provide actionable solutions to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A very fitting close. Thank you, Ranjita. And you remind me that I think it's very true, as evidenced by this panel, that the feminist scholars are still asking the most important questions today and leading the way on a lot of important investigations. So we appreciate your comments. Also, special thanks again to Nozomi, Deepa, Jessica, Rosemary, Esther, and Fiorella. And also want to extend a special thanks to Viviana Infantes, who provided our event support, Andrea Prado and Jose Torres at SIP for their web and design support, and Antonella Calazos and Anthony Carbonell for their masterful IT support of today's Zoom session. We want to thank you again for joining us. Please, we encourage you to reach out to any of the panelists if there are questions that occur to you after the fact, which is always what happens to me. I always think about what I want to ask when I'm in the car ride home. Anyway, an enlightening discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.